Be strong.
That golden morning sunlight shone on the academy. There was Li Han and his friend Digiling sitting and talking to each other. She took the cup of tea and tasted it. Li Han introduced it as one Dana's special tea. When she drank it, she felt the tea was a bit thick but delicious. At that moment, a group of friends approached the two of them. He himself couldn't believe that we could meet each other here. Sienna looked happy and said, "I'm looking for you." He suddenly asked Sienna what was going on. She simply answered it was alchemy homework. She spoke up and discussed wanting to gather ingredients together to make magic medicine. But in that group there was still one person who was quite timid. Li Han stood up and looked at her from the perspective of a student from the Phoenix Tower. Everyone was scared when Li Han looked at him with those eyes, because he found it strange that the student from the last tower asked to join his group. Li Han saw that the idea was good, seeing that Sienna immediately asked him to invite more students from Thang Long Tower, but there was a face from Fnaxi that was silently observing, which was Digiling. Seeing that Li Han seemed hesitant, everyone gradually said goodbye to each other and went first. As we walked, everyone talked together. Just looking at his eyes almost gave me a heart attack. Digiling, she questioned him asking if he was close to Sienna or not, but the two were just alchemy classmates. Hearing this, she seemed dumbfounded. He then gently reassured her that it was nothing. Li Han further advised her not to interrupt in the middle like that, it would only increase her curiosity, but she herself felt that talking behind her back was not polite. Because Digiling felt like he was saying bad things about her, Li Han still didn't understand what it meant to say bad things about her. He thought he was more curious now, but she wasn't easy to pry. She raised her face to look at him. Then I saw Li Han carrying out a stone statue. Kneeling down, hands clasped. Digiling wondered what he was doing. Then he suddenly replied, "Because talking behind your back is not good, but if you say something when praying, nothing is wrong." She intended to gently touch her hand and, well, he didn't want to listen to her while he was praying. Digiling, she shook her head in defeat, but he felt like that wasn't enough. Li Han prayed that he almost died because he was ambushed by White Tower students, and almost didn't survive. Hearing such a vow, Digiling heard it and stood still. The boy on this side continued to talk. If Sienna had conspired when the group entered the mountain together, then even he couldn't imagine it. And he was sure the gods would watch. While praying, Li Han still did not forget to look at her. Suddenly she spoke up and said she didn't do this to accuse anyone. After hearing this, he immediately brightened up happily. Then Digiling, she repeated as if she didn't want to hear it while she was praying. They both knelt down and prayed together. Li Han thought to himself, she's angry. Everyone at the Phoenix Tower is very kind and pious, but not everyone can throw away worldly emotions. Even though faith must not exist, jealousy and superiority should not exist. Last week at Phoenix Dormitory, a new male student created a magic potion to restore energy. He brought it and invited everyone to enjoy it. The other two students tried it and complimented that the potion was refreshing, then praised the new student for doing very well. One male student even joked with him that maybe he was even better at making magic potions than Sister Sienna. At that moment, the male student turned to ask Sister Sienna to see what she thought. She just laughed and said that compared to the new male student, she still lacked a lot of experience, and at that time nothing happened. But the next day, Sister Sienna brought several bottles of magic medicine and she asked if everyone wanted to try the magic medicine she prepared. Everyone took it and said thank you to Sienna, and also praised her magic medicine for being very effective. After the two students finished drinking, they felt refreshed, but at that time it was because people weren't paying too much attention. But the next day, and the day after that, Sister Sienna did the same thing. She still made magic medicine and brought it to everyone. When everyone drank, she even asked about the taste of the magic medicine. Sienna kept asking how it was, and each time, she wanted confirmation. When everyone realized something was wrong, when the male student said Sister Sienna was the best, she stopped. Thinking about this, Li Han suddenly darkened his face. He relaxed his face again, then told Digiling that Sister Sienna had a competitive spirit. Digiling countered that things don't seem to stop there. Some time later, Sienna accidentally met the little boy and he warmly spoke to Sister Sienna. He complimented her on how wonderful the magic potion she brewed was, but Sister Sienna just walked by without saying anything. That made the student stunned and softly called out, "Sister Sienna." Digiling stood in a corner, also stunned by her unusual actions. Returning to the present, Digiling explained to Li Han that Sister Sienna was deliberately ignoring the male student. When he heard that, he immediately exclaimed that she was so vindictive. Li Han thought that if it was just such a small thing that would make her react like that. Thinking of this, he remembered the compliments he had received. He immediately became suspicious of the compliments he received in class. Digiling now prayed. Li Han asked her if there was anything else she wanted to tell. She didn't tell any more, but just said that she was praying, and didn't know what Li Han was saying. He saw Digiling stand up to leave, so he quickly stood up too. His hands clenched into fists. He thought that if things were like that, well, he himself had to be really careful in alchemy class, but Li Han also had to face another challenge. In the basic magic characteristics education class, by Principal OSU Gon adults, he told his students to love and cooperate with each other. And he said he didn't care about each person's personal feelings, and noted that Principal OSU Gon adults would give the students group assignments. The assignment he assigned was that members of each tower would break into another tower, with the purpose of stealing the flag placed in the new student lobby. And the students should immediately recognize it from the pattern on the flag. It must be earned before the next class. Speaking of this, Principal OSU Gon adults announced that the lesson ended here. When school ends, many students are moody and tired. They thought that if the principal did that, he would teach them special magical properties, and didn't the principal want them to fight? Other students also complained to the heavens, "What the hell is this class?" And they also wonder why it must be the White Tiger Tower, and it is impossible to negotiate with them. The target of the White Tiger Tower is also their tower, and why don't the two sides exchange? The students lamented and said to each other that the students at the White Tiger Tower were barbarians and had no shame. Another male student also spoke up and said that they would definitely keep their word. Those students quickly brushed this aside, because they thought it was a waste of time, and if it was just one lesson, that's it. Seeing them in such low spirits, Li Han immediately felt something was wrong. He thought that it was impossible to lose well like that, and that if he gave up before the assignment, it would be like throwing away the score. We really don't know what kind of homework this crazy school will give, but people are going to give up on a simple assignment. And Li Han was determined. There was no way he would allow his score to drop. He quickly stepped forward and called everyone. He advises people not to give up early. When they saw that he was the one to speak up, the other students immediately called his name Wadanaz, and they asked him if there was any way. And they hope Li Han has a way to help them. They also think he is hiding his profession. Seeing their excitement, Li Han immediately had to admire how quickly these people turned around. When he was about to speak, someone suddenly interrupted. It was a Shandalkard. She thought she knew what he wanted to say. She lifted her glasses with a cool look and said, there was a 95% chance that Li Han wanted to sneak into the White Tiger Tower. Li Han spoke up and said that a Shandalkard was right, but just that made the other students constantly express their admiration for him. They began to gather around Li Han and Yoner and talk, knowing for sure that the plan would be risky, and they asked him to let them join. And they thought that Li Han was the only one who could lead them, and he was the one who planned it. Hearing this, his face could no longer be happy. He secretly understood that they didn't want to have to think about it or anything, but there was no other way, so Li Han agreed. When they saw Li Han agreeing to help them, they kept shouting, saying, "The White Tigers, just wait, they will take everything." When he saw that scene, he was expressionless and thought that everything was really as he thought. Characteristics education was completely meaningless. The next day, the sun peeked out from behind the mountains. Li Han yawned as he walked. While walking, he suddenly stopped for a moment. He was lucky to see the sun slowly rising. Because of the rare sight, he stopped for a moment to watch the sunrise. After a while, Li Han remembered that the deadline was almost over and he had to quickly sneak into the White Tiger Tower to complete Professor Uragon's homework. When he arrived, he was a little worried that he didn't know which mission would be more difficult. When he pushed the door open, Li Han saw Professor Volody sitting and reading a book. Seeing him coming, Professor Volody closed the book in his hand. Volody immediately spoke up about his tardiness. He was 11 seconds late. Li Han bowed his head and apologized to Vodali because he was busy taking care of the horse, but he said he didn't need to apologize. After that, Vodali also said that Li Han was the one who suffered. Hearing that, he forced a smile and wondered where the professor learned that sentence. Vodali started, then told Li Han to try rotating the iron ball. He nodded in agreement. Next, Li-Han came to show off his talent. He picked up that iron ball and spun it. The iron ball rotated in a circle right in front of Professor Vodali. Seeing that his abilities had improved, Vodali thought that the previous battle had awakened him. He also did not expect that Li-Han's level was beyond expectations. When he finished performing, Professor Vodali said it wasn't bad and told him to go back to his seat. He quickly thanked him. Professor Vodali's compliment just made him a bit surprised. He couldn't believe that Professor Vodali was not bad. Li-Han said that was a rare compliment from Professor Vodali. He then came over and asked Li-Han to summon the water element. He also nodded and agreed to do so. Li-Han started to do it. He summoned the water element with the two words flowing. While doing it, Li-Han secretly thought that thanks to Professor Garcia's punishments, he was able to control those lessons to this extent. At this time, Professor Vodali pointed at the iron ball. He asked him to compress it to the size of the ball. Li-Han looked and agreed to try it. He started moving the crystal element. While doing it, Li-Han suddenly felt a bit difficult. This was actually much more difficult than he thought, because Professor Vodali said to compress it, not throw it away, so he needed to work even harder. Professor Vodali gently picked up the iron ball. This made him question why he was holding up the iron ball, which made him a bit confused. Professor Vodali started using his power with the iron ball. He controlled it to fly straight to Li-Han. Seeing that, Li-Han couldn't help but silently curse this old professor. Li-Han's water element is a bit unstable right now. A moment later, the glass element shattered everywhere. The iron and water components now exist in parallel. A few short seconds later, both the iron ball and the water fell to the ground. Li-Han looked at them with a surprised face. Professor Vodali didn't say anything at this time, he just looked at Li-Han. Seeing him calmly take the iron ball back, Li-Han spoke up and asked something. Li-Han cautiously asked if Professor Vodali was going to throw the iron ball at him again. Hearing that, he just asked him again if something was wrong. Li-Han was scared and said he thought it seemed a bit dangerous. Vodali looked at him and said that this is also very effective. Li-Han was stunned and couldn't say anything more. Vodali also thought that he must have experienced the same thing when fighting anti-magic. Stressful moments sharpened his concentration and instincts, and his ability to control mana. Vodali thought why should he find a more complicated way, when the solution was right in front of him. He couldn't believe it when he heard that. He thought the professor was really serious, because at that moment he almost fell in love with them. Vodali seemed to see that Li-Han understood the purpose of what he said, so he decided to continue. Li-Han was patient and thought that arguing would only waste more time. He started to do it again, and the crystal element appeared again. When he saw the crystal element appear, he thought that it was not the same as a spirit stone or an iron ball, because its water did not have a certain shape, so to be able to do it, Li-Han needed to concentrate more, besides that he also had to think of a way to compress it. Professor Vodali observed every movement of the crystal element. He started holding up the iron ball. Once again the iron ball flew straight to the crystal element, and from there aimed straight at him. It seemed that this time Li-Han knew in advance. He thought that Professor Vodali would attack again unexpectedly. But Li-Han did not know that the iron ball was right behind him. Very quickly, the iron ball rushed to attack Li-Han's back. Only then did he realize that the iron ball was also attacking the back. Professor Vodali took back the iron ball in his hand and witnessed Li-Han's pain. Because for better results, Vodali constantly reminded him that he needed to concentrate more. Li-Han's whole body was soaked. He looked straight at the professor as if he was sure of one thing: a class with a lot of homework was better than this place. Scene changed to a class on basic magic recognition. There were a few students talking enthusiastically. The female student asked the other male student if he had to collect herbs from the mountains recently for his alchemy homework. The student immediately said it was because this time the professor and Jeldel agreed to go with the students from the other tower. The female student was suddenly surprised. They all looked at Li-Han and thought, Professor Engoldel was there with Wardanas. When they saw his eyes and expression, they immediately knew that he must be very tired. The students encouraged each other, thinking it would definitely be okay. Li-Han saw their attitude and thought they wanted to talk to him. At this time there was a noise outside the classroom. The professor walked in and greeted all his students. All students also politely and seriously greeted the professor. The professor came and said that today, the students would learn something other than elemental magic, but it wasn't him who taught, it was someone else. He brought a professor who was an expert in the field. He comes here. Hearing that, the students all talked to each other. One liked it and hoped it would be a spiritist because he liked spiritism, and another wanted to learn how to make charms. The other student, I hope to learn healing magic. The professor invited that person to come in, and the door began to open. This professor came in with a very gloomy atmosphere. When the professor first walked in, all the students were trembling because they felt that coldness. They kept asking each other why it was so cold. This professor walked in, stroking his beard. The gloomy atmosphere has enveloped the entire classroom, originating from this mysterious new professor. He looked at the students, then gently said that he was also happy to meet everyone. Li-han looked at the professor and introduced himself as Morton. He also said that he himself teaches black magic. He began to explain more clearly about some techniques in the subject, such as necromancy to communicate with the dead, or curse techniques that use dolls to spread disasters. Besides, there are dark elements and poisons. There are also negative energies and other things. Because of these mysterious and dangerous things, most people do not like black magic. As an example of how people perceive black magic, in a dark, deserted forest, Yoner and Gai Nandu are shivering because they are trapped here. He was shaking like a leaf, his hands clung to Yoner's shoulders, his mouth stuttering in fear because he was lost and didn't know how to get out. Suddenly, in a tense moment, a hand placed on Gai Nandu's shoulder and asked. Both were startled and hugged each other, screaming out of fear, not knowing what had just touched them. It turned out that it wasn't a ghost at all but just a normal person. He asked the two of them if they were lost. Seeing the light spell coming from him, Gai Nandu thought it was a magician, so he immediately asked about how to escape the forest. But he refused to lead them because he was busy. From behind him appeared a very strange-looking human skeleton, then he told them to follow his friend. Yoner immediately widened his eyes in fear when he saw a skeleton clearly in front of him. The next second, she and Gai Nandu were lying on the ground unconscious. He and the skeleton were also confused when they accidentally scared them to the point of fainting, and this is how people view black magic. The new students all had the same thought: why did they come to this prestigious academy to learn black magic, and how would outsiders judge them? Seeing that all the students reacted violently, Professor Garcia immediately stood up and explained that black magic is a field full of mysteries and contains many truths. Seeing her convincing the students, Professor Morton didn't say anything but just coughed a few times. Professor Garcia advised students that black magic is a raw gem that has not been polished, so they must experience and control their own choices instead of being hesitant because of prejudices. She hopes to see in her students the spirit of magicians and that they will always devote themselves to discovering the nature of truth. Hearing Professor Garcia be so sincere, Yoner was a little shaken. After helping the students understand more about this subject, she happily asked the students if anyone wanted to be a teaching assistant for today's class. Contrary to the professor's expectations, the whole class fell silent, making the classroom atmosphere heavy. Li-han thought for a moment, then hesitantly raised his hand. But Gai Nandu sitting next to him saw his intention. He slammed Li-han's face under the table and stopped him. Li-han felt that the blow just now was painful, but Gai Nandu did not apologize to him. On the contrary, he threatened Li-han that he would become one of Professor Morton's immortal soldiers if he had any relationship with the dark magician. However, Li-han felt that black magic was a hidden gem, so he would easily get points if there was little competition. Gai Nandu knew that he was planning to become a dark magician and his face was as green as a banana leaf, but Li-han thought he was overreacting a bit. Then Li-han stood up and told Gai Nandu that being a magician was not bad, it could guarantee him an easy and long life. He stood up and boldly volunteered to be a teaching assistant. Seeing Li-han as the savior of today's class, Professor Garcia couldn't help but feel happy and touched. He also understood Professor Garcia's feelings at this time. Because before, Li-han also witnessed during an observation period that no one raised their hand to speak, and her expression was exactly like that professor's worried face. And that is also the reason why teaching assistants must prepare in advance for situations such as reading the answers to questions in advance. Professor Morton saw that he volunteered and thanked Li-han and invited Li-han to the podium. As he walked, he wondered why the classroom had been so cold all this time. It turned out that it was Professor Morton who was emitting a large amount of negative energy. Natural mana does not contain elements, it will change according to the element the magician uses. This type of dark mana is a characteristic of dark magicians. If they all emitted this type of aura, then he would understand why it was not common. Looking at Li-han, Professor Morton seemed to realize there was something special about him. The professor also saw that there was a rich source of mana flowing within him. Li-han came before Professor Morton and thanked him. To start the class, Professor Morton first raised his hand and gave an example. A very strange-looking black aura emitted from his body. The professor ordered the dragon slave to rise. Receiving orders, a bunch of zombies from everywhere came to life. The zombies he summoned looked very scary, with missing parts and ragged clothes. The next second they moved closer to the students, making them howl like swallows, so scared that their hair stood on end. The students screamed, some told the other students to do something, some told the zombies not to push them. Suddenly they stopped harassing the students and grabbed my hand. Then the zombies gathered into a circle and rotated, making it difficult for the students to understand why they did that. Facing this strange scene, Professor Morton calmly asked Li-han what he thought. He shyly said he had prepared this performance for the practitioners. Li-han witnessed this domineering debut of his and reluctantly smiled and gave a few compliments. Professor Garcia saw this and was extremely grateful and thanked him. Seeing that he was bored, Professor Morton said that was enough of the beautiful magic show, then he raised his hand. The professor then slammed his hand into the air and ordered the zombies to disappear. The next second their images gradually blurred. Then it completely disappeared into the sky, leaving only a few clouds of purple smoke. The students saw that this terrible performance had finally ended and were very relieved and thanked God. After the warm-up program ended, Li-han had to admit that Professor Morton performed the spell very quickly. But he suddenly sweat-dropped as he wondered if what he did was because he wanted him to do the same thing. Realizing that he was worried, Professor Morton quickly shook his head and reassured Li-han that he did not need to learn this spell because it was too difficult for beginners. After hearing this, he felt completely relieved and Li-han wished that Professor Vodali could hear this. Continuing, he told Li-han he could try changing mana into negative energy. He quickly obeyed and put his hand into his shirt to take out his chopsticks. Then from inside his shirt, Li-han took out the wand and prepared to try it. Professor Garcia was standing to the side and silently observing his performance. She smiled and thought that even if it was Li-han, this would not be easy. Because even magicians have to experiment and make countless mistakes to be able to visualize negative energy, it is a very vague and macroscopic thing. If one thinks about cold, it becomes the element of ice. If one thinks about darkness, it becomes the dark element, because the topic of negative energy is so vague that it is difficult to grasp. Professor Garcia decided that while Li-han was trying, she would look at the other students. Suddenly, right behind her, there was a purple aura spreading in the air. She was startled and turned her head around to see that stream of air coming from Li-han's place. Looking from behind him, Professor Garcia still couldn't believe what was happening. Just a second ago, she thought Li-han was also struggling with this, but now she didn't expect that he was doing it in a very calm way. Li-han did it. He slowly changed his mana into negative energy, from his wand creating a purple aura in his hand. The other students who witnessed this also marveled at the strength of Li-han, who had experienced two worlds. That is, he has a very diverse imagination. Li-han only needs to think of complex mathematical concepts, such as hyperbolic geometry or complex numbers. Just the first time a first-year student like Li-han was able to master this task, Professor Morton was also very surprised. Amused by his performance, Professor Morton immediately praised him and asked him to do it again. Without hesitation, Li-han quickly raised his wand, and performed again to the surprise of Professor Garcia. At this moment, she couldn't help but be confused. She didn't expect Li-han to be so good. She was worried that he wouldn't be very good if he had this kind of talent. Because Professor Garcia is afraid that he will change his love for black magic, that is the hunch of a professor who is afraid that his multi-talented student will be taken away by his colleagues. While her heart was filled with anxiety and telling herself not to doubt Li-han, she suddenly stopped for a moment. Looking at Li-han, he was still continuing to convert mana into streams of negative energy that spread throughout the room. Li-han slowly asked Professor Morton when he should start. Seeing that Professor Morton was not moving, he glanced over at him, but unexpectedly saw a strange scene. His eyes were now bloodshot, his face was gloomy, observing his performance in an attitude that couldn't have been more serious. His eyes showed red veins, then told Li-han that he should continue according to his ability, keep summoning until exhausted. Seeing Professor Morton looking at him intently as if he wanted to eat him alive, Li-han couldn't help but feel nervous. He thought he must be crazy. But in Professor Garcia's eyes at this moment, she did not expect Professor Morton to be so happy. Even so, looking around at the students who were gradually being affected by too much negative energy, she decided to tell Li-han to stop. Professor Garcia, to avoid other topics, quickly asked Professor Morton what the next step was. He refused again, saying it would be more interesting to observe Li Han to see if he could summon more negative energy. She continued to convince him that they could check later. Even though she was distracted by her, Professor Morton still refused to give up. He turned back to say something more. But without letting Professor Morton say more, she turned serious and pressed her face close to him and told him to move on to the next step. While he was sighing, Li Han wondered what he should do with this amount of mana. Then Professor Morton picked up his wand and told him to wave his wand and say the following spell. He pointed his wand at where Li Han was standing and chanted the paralysis spell. The spell he had just recited was a low-level paralysis curse. It caused a mild paralysis similar to when the calf is tired. It was a basic magic that Li Han's level could perform. And curses need to be cast on an object, so Li Han wondered who he would cast it on. The other students who didn't want to be the chosen one all looked away without looking at him. Surprisingly, Professor Morton pointed at himself. He calmly said that the person who would be cursed was none other than himself, of course. Hearing that the person he was going to curse was a professor, Li Han couldn't help but be surprised. When the other students saw that they had escaped a disaster, they breathed a sigh of relief. Li Han did want to use magic on a certain professor, but seeing that he might blow in the wind and fall, he was a bit hesitant. He still didn't believe it and asked Professor Morton if he could really do that. He firmly confirmed and asked him to do it quickly. Thinking back, Li Han realized that he was worrying too much. He was just a new student. Why should he worry about the professor? If so, then he wouldn't beat around the bush anymore. Li Han took his wand and began casting paralysis on Professor Morton. He still stood very calmly and did not resist or show any fear. That was because the level of a new student was nothing to him. Once Li Han saw that he could easily block it, he would understand how profound the black magic was. Everything was within Professor Morton's calculations. Li Han would beg him to teach him after failing to cast a paralysis spell, and he would of course agree. Professor Morton thought that things would probably happen like that, and his heart was filled with anticipation and joy. While he wondered if Li Han would come looking for him after this class, he was trying to concentrate on gathering his mana. He controlled a large amount of black gas to gather in one place. However, Professor Garcia was also panicked because he seemed to have gathered too much unnecessary mana. After collecting a large amount of mana, Li Han pointed his wand forward and cast a paralysis spell on him. Then the air rushed towards Professor Morton and penetrated his body. In just a split second, Professor Morton was overwhelmed by Li Han's terrible strength, causing him to freeze for 5 seconds, his face turning pale. Suddenly Professor Morton's whole body became wobbly. Then, to the horror of all the students watching, then he couldn't resist anymore and fell to the ground. Li Han saw that and quickly ran back. Li Han quickly sat down next to him and repeatedly called the professor and asked about his condition. This was completely beyond Professor Morton's expectations. He had no defense, so when Li Han took a hit, he couldn't bear it and lay there pretending to be half dead. At this time, when Li Han fell into a difficult situation, he could not accept the image of himself being sent to prison for assassinating a professor. But fortunately, he was able to sit up on his hands and knees. Seeing that Professor Morton was able to sit up stably made him still a little worried and surprised. He stared at Professor Morton to observe his situation. He just looked down, remained silent without saying a word. Suddenly Professor Morton stood up as if nothing had happened and laughed and asked everyone if they had seen it. That was a low-level paralysis spell. He not only scolded him but also praised Li Han for doing a great job. Seeing that he was now out of danger, he breathed a sigh of relief knowing that the professor was only pretending to warm up the class. Professor Garcia has been quietly standing in a corner observing all this time. Even though he was fine, she still found something strange. Perhaps she thought it wasn't an act just now because the huge amount of mana had just hit Professor Morton while he was completely defenseless. For now, Professor Garcia decided to ask about Professor Morton's health first. He turned around and replied, "Of course not." But Professor Morton only pretended that he was fine, but deep inside there were tears. His mouth said no but his hands kept shaking. At this moment she also understood that Professor Morton was not pretending to fall. Professor Garcia also couldn't help but panic when he had to accept the fact that he really fell under Li Han's curse. Professor Morton mentioned that Li Han had a talent for learning black magic, but Li Han was not interested, so in order not to offend him, he thanked him. Professor Morton deliberately reminded Li Han that he was very talented with cold eyes, making Li Han skeptical. He even thought it was ironic. Li Han fell into deep contemplation, worrying about how bad he was doing. He was gradually psychologically manipulated. Li Han looked depressed, thinking that if he was good from the beginning, he wouldn't need to be a first-year student. Professor Garcia Kim talked about the diversity of the Black Magic Tower. The students listened attentively as she talked about how to learn low-level curse magic without difficulty and its benefits in the future. It sounded very convincing. Professor Garcia also explained more about curses, not only to threaten but also to defend himself. In the background, Professor Morton clapped Li Han's hand and told him to return to his seat. She also suggested that if she wanted to deal with a type of magic, she would learn that magic, but Professor Morton suggested that she should carefully study various types of magic, and she also agreed. Li Han quickly took his seat, all eyes focused on him. Garcia Kim picked up his magic wand. The performance was about to begin. She watched the whole class begin to prepare. Professor Morton silently looked at her expression, so he let the young people run wild. Garcia Kim touched the magic stick to the floor. A blue aura surrounded them and Garcia Kim teleported simultaneously. The matrix is formed. The students are also in the matrix. A blue color covers the entire classroom. The power and light were so strong that the students closed their eyes and stopped. Meanwhile, Li Han struggled to open his eyes to observe and feel this magic. Suddenly Li Han fell onto the empty ground, still surrounded by that green air. Before Li Han realized it, he did not expect to appear in this strange place. Then both Ashan and Yoner were also present, feeling wild and worried at this moment. Yoner didn't understand what was going on. A moment later the students were also here. According to information, this was the training ground. They guessed it was teleportation that brought them here. Jigel and his friend were startled by Garcia Kim's voice. Garcia Kim predicted that the students would be surprised. Garcia Kim mentioned the reason because she wanted the students to practice together, so she teleported the whole class to this place. Since it was already here, she hoped the students would start practicing. Hearing that, the students were extremely excited to learn magic and have a spacious room. It was true that she understood the students' psychology. Li Han looked around. Li Han noticed the atmosphere in which the students began to actively practice compared to the beginning of the class. He couldn't help but admire how great Professor Garcia was. Then Professor Garcia Kim clapped his hands and asked the students to pair up to practice. A moment later the sound of a collision rang out. Li Han went to the battlefield holding a stick, hoping that his opponent would take care of him, but that was just an early game ritual to respect his opponent. Over there, Guy Nandu, like Li Han, hopes to be taken care of. The two people stood facing each other. The atmosphere was very tense. The rules of the match were very simple. They will attack in turns. Guy Nandu's first turn and Li Han's second turn will then switch. The purpose of this battle is not only to attack but also to allow us to experience being hit by a curse. Guy Nandu held his wand tightly in his hand and aimed tightly. Guy Nandu first converted mana into negative energy. A stream of negative energy gathered at the tip of the wand. Li Han also noticed that Guy Nandu could also move faster than him. Li Han mentioned the problem of Guy Nandu always having trouble with other elements, where it burns. He thought about the case of Guy Nandu being gifted with dark magic. He was more gifted with the dark side. But Li Han thought of another way. This magic was simple, but it was unreasonable, making him shiver a bit. Seeing that the two students had finished preparing, Professor Morton started the match. Witnessing Guy Nandu with his own eyes made Professor Morton confused, but he found a student with great talent. Guy Nandu began to perform the magic. Spiritual energy gathered to fill the stick. Guy Nandu shouted loudly, paralyzing the last step to complete this magic. Li Han was embraced by Guy Nandu's magic, making him unable to resist. Now Li Han felt the feeling of being controlled by magic. Successfully locking Li Han, Guy Nandu happily celebrated his success. Li Han also congratulated him. Guy Nandu wanted to know where Li Han was paralyzed because Li Han looked normal, which made him very curious. Li Han honestly felt all over his body and said that he didn't feel any numbness anywhere. Receiving the answer made Guy Nandu hesitate. He thought it was because there was a problem with his spell or because he chanted it wrong. Li Han thought it was because he was too cautious when chanting the spell, so he told him to try to exaggerate, but Guy Nandu was still a little skeptical. But then he did it. Be numb, idiot. Seeing that the two students were having difficulty, Garcia Kim quickly stood up to solve the problem. She wanted the students to slow down and listen to what she had to say. Garcia Kim hugged Guy Nan tightly. She said that because Li Han had too much mana, the magic was ineffective, but he succeeded. Hearing that, Guy Nandu was excited and thanked her for explaining, then she left because a student called her. Holding the magic stick in front of him, Guy Nandu fell into deep contemplation and began to doubt that he was not suitable for black magic. Guy Nandu laughed out loud. He knew he had no intention of learning it, so he let it go. He wanted Li Han to start using the dark magic. After all, it was his turn. Seeing that he was okay, Li Han happily acted. He came here. Li Han began to feel that he needed to focus on controlling without using too much mana. The dark gas billowing on the tip of the magic wand was a powerful and magical purple color. Li Han recited the incantation with 2 numb words, then turned towards Guy Nandu decisively. Professor Morton had to open his eyes wide to look at Li Han. He did not expect him to read the spell so briefly, making him a bit surprised. Standing in the distance, he observed the 2 students, especially Li Han. As far as he knew, holding long spells was easier for magicians to cast, and reading them quickly was not easy. He could not believe that Li Han was able to break through, surpass like that. Guy Nandu stood still, receiving the full flow of black magic into his body. The stream of darkness was getting closer and closer to the temple. Guy Nandu looked at the stream of darkness that was getting bigger and bigger. The dark demon formed a giant monster surrounded by cold air, its long arms embracing Guy Nandu full of demonic energy. Guy Nandu was scared to death, his face turned pale. He kept screaming when he saw this scene. He tried to avoid the powerful darkness that made him constantly sweat and feel nervous as if he were fighting death. Guy Nandu fell to the ground and cried out in pain. Yoner and Ashan in the distance also heard the screams and turned to look. Even the other students were caught by the cry and stopped. Li Han looked at Guy Nandu safely lying on the floor panting. Li Han mentioned that he should not avoid dark ghosts. Being reprimanded by Li Han made Guy Nandu unable to bear it and scolded him. Guy Nandu used the excuse that he followed his instinct and avoided it. Professor Morton listened to the 2 people's conversation and was startled. Professor Morton did not expect Guy Nandu to dodge so smoothly, but only by instinct. He truly knew how to enlighten this old body. He remembered the image when Guy Nandu converted energy. He commented that he converted good elements very quickly. In addition, it accurately senses dark mana and dodges very smoothly. Looking at Guy Nandu in a fiery state preparing a defensive attack attracted Morton's attention. He was curious about his name. Going from one surprise to another made Professor Morton tremble. This corpse is hard to stand. This kind of talent is hard to find. Professor Morton commented that Guy Nandu is a genius that comes only once every 10 years, and that aura is indissoluble and very domineering. Under the golden sunlight, the black magic class ended. No major incidents happened. The noise still echoed. Everyone cursed each other and everyone enjoyed this fun lesson, as crazy as it sounds. Garcia clapped his hands to attract the students' attention. She asked the students how they felt about the class and gave Professor Morton, today's teaching assistant, a round of applause. The students responded and smiled with excitement. She immediately started the main topic. Are you guys interested in black magic yet? The question was like a knife piercing the heart. A moment ago, he was happy and now fell silent, startling and completely helpless Garcia. To break the silence, she suggested that Morton say something, and he nodded in agreement. As soon as he raised his voice with joy about black magic, he believed everyone had seen the appeal of black magic. Some students also showed interest in it. The words immediately made the students stand still, surprised. They immediately chatted and asked if the other person liked it. Guy Nandu next to them still smiled happily. He smiled sarcastically with his hands behind his head. This professor was really funny, saying no one was interested in black magic. Just when he was still happily laughing and telling boring professor jokes, the professor invited him back to his office for a drink. This startled him, making him pale and panicked. He cried helplessly. Why did it have to be him? His friends seemed to have caught gold, competing with each other to wish him a happy trip. Without waiting long, he immediately mentioned someone else. Pointing at him, Li Han stood behind with white hair, his face seemingly predicting the outcome. If it's just to earn points, black magic is not a bad choice, he quickly agreed. Yes, Professor. Behind him, a figure stepped forward, causing Guy Nandu to look back. The group of friends behind him rushed to hug him, grumbling that it was his fault that Li Han was arrested. They wanted him to go quickly and begged to come alone, which made him cry without making a sound. Guy Nandu blushed to the point of crying. He would definitely drag him along. His friends still forced him to withdraw his offer, causing both sides to quarrel. Garcia helplessly hoped they would stop arguing. The scene immediately changes to the image of the feet touching a dark place. The magician's office is like a research institute. The professors who work here are all strange people, with tired faces from working for days without sleep, red eyes looking at the series of symbols on the paper. This is where students become the subject of endless research. The image of listless and tired professors is a trademark in this field. It sounds very strange, but it is true to what I described. Li-han had heard it a lot at home. He was helpless at the way it worked. It sounded like a master's training school. When I was a child, I didn't think that hell existed. Standing in front of the entrance, he realized that today was different. He was a first-year student, so the meeting was simply an interview. Guy Nandu next to him kept trembling close to him, her eyes filled with tears. In front of the two of them is Professor Morton's workplace, which is dark and gray. At a glance, he knew what this place was researching: wooden crates with dangerous nails nailed to the outside. There are scattered bones in front of the gate, and there are graves outside the stairs, giving a feeling of gloom. Guy Nandu's voice rang out, trembling weakly. He didn't understand what they both did wrong to be called out, his eyes wet with tears, and Li-han standing by helplessly. Maybe it wasn't because he did something wrong. Guy Nandu screamed and cried. He felt that the dark magicians were easily angered, but Li-han, who was in front, didn't pay any attention, just said to come in quickly. Li-han knocked lightly on the black door to call the professor. The door opened automatically, giving Guy Nandu goosebumps. He turned pale and looked inside. The door opened, but there was no one on the other side, surprising Guy Nandu and Li-han. Seeing the above scene, he trembled even more intensely, making Li-han helpless and calm down. But he still looked around clearly and observed. The space was vast and the smoke covered them, so they couldn't see clearly. They relied on the dim light to see the road. Where is the professor? He searched suspiciously. On the other side, the professor and a person with wings were talking to each other. Feeling someone coming, the professor immediately raised his head, and the children had arrived. Very quickly, he ordered someone with wings to quickly bring the kids here, but was immediately interrupted by the principal's words forbidding him from approaching new students. He glanced again, wondering why he didn't do it secretly. Diret on the other side was startled and reminded him that the professor himself had just been released from prison not long ago. Morton immediately objected that it was not a prison but a detention room. Again, chased Diret away. Anyway, he received the news and told him to leave quickly. As soon as he left, Morton used his wand to spin around a few times. Through the look and the glowing tip of the wand, a stream of air flew towards the two of them. Opening his eyes, Li-han was surprised by a flash of light. Around the two of them, it was no longer dark, the house was brighter, and the view opened up, making the two of them confused. The inside of the tower was more normal than he thought. Li-han looked around in surprise and found himself facing him. The interior of the tower is almost made from bones, with a white color from the tables to the chairs. For magicians who control skeletons, bone is the most popular material. Of course, they will receive many discriminatory looks from colleagues, such as that he is strange. While the two were still looking at the tower, Guy Nandu saw the professor sitting on the other side. Morton sat at the table, looking at the two people happily greeting. In front were two chairs reserved for the two of them. Both of them quickly greeted him. The teacher didn't say much and just told him to sit down. Li-han turned around to look at Guy Nandu and breathed a sigh of relief, not having the heart to remind him that the table and chairs he was sitting on were made from bones. The teacher smiled gently and happily asked both of them why he called them here. Guy Nandu quickly answered, wanting to quickly finish and get out of here. He said he had done wrong, and Morton said they were both gifted with black magic. At the same time, he was quickly suppressed when he said what he said. As soon as the other person said it, everyone was startled and confused. The professor slammed his hand on the table. As soon as I said it was a reason, Guy Nandu immediately denied it was anything. On the contrary, he thought he hadn't heard wrong. He lowered his head and covered his face, not believing that he was a talented black magician. His eyes were filled with doubt and suspicion. Guy Nandu whispered to Li-han that they had unique talents, but he told him not to say they were unique. He silently said that he was not interested but had talent. His dark face looked down. The next moment, I was excited, my face lifted up proudly. What should I do? The surroundings immediately sparkled brighter. But Li-han originally thought he would be angry or refuse, but this time he complied. The professor held out his hand. Inside were black-coated candies shaped like skulls, looking extremely dangerous. Morton immediately mentioned that they both had a talent for black magic, so he wanted to call in for advice, and black magic was also extremely interesting. Guy Nandu, holding the candy in his hand, was bewildered. Li Han, next to him, was stunned. He had heard these words somewhere. The above statement reminded him of the professors who teach top majors who are often very complacent. They want to learn from me. With their qualifications, they don't pay attention to those who don't have potential. So what about the professors who teach extra subjects? They looked at each other nervously from behind. Professors in our field are already at the bottom of society. The atmosphere around them calms down. So we can only go up, one person said frantically. Li Han sat still and looked at the candies. He could sympathize with the desperation of the professors in less educated fields. Leaving the dark tower, Li Han went first. Guy Nandu had a smiling face and happily sang. He didn't expect that he was a sought-after talent. Li Han next to him heard it and immediately glanced at it, but didn't care because he had other things to worry about. In the hands of the two people was a white bone wrapped with a gold string tied with a bow, carefully and meticulously. Guy Nandu asked and looked at the professor. "What is this, Professor?" Morton didn't say. He just hoped he would keep it. "This is the gift the teacher gave you." As he spoke, his face turned red and his hand snorted shyly. Li Han raised his hand and wanted the professor to tell him what this was, so Guy Nandu pulled him away. The bone in his hand emitted purple smoke, making him a bit suspicious. The professor didn't say what it was. He held it in his hand and couldn't help but think what kind of bone it was, and he immediately started sweating profusely. Or it's like the principal's book, the bone makes you think of him. To understand clearly, Li Han immediately thought of the story of the couple, who became friends by giving an ancient relic, a kind of surprise gift between the couple. Just thinking about it made him cover his mouth. Guy Nandu called him several times before getting his attention back. But just as he was about to listen, Guy Nandu scratched his head, afraid to speak. Then he told him not to tell Macon somewhere. His face turned red with embarrassment. As soon as he looked, he realized the meaning in the sentence. Hearing this, he remembered the incident where Guy Nandu said alchemy was for girls and accidentally said that Yanera learned it was useless, so he guessed that he was afraid that people would tease him for saying that. Li Han immediately agreed, asking him to also keep it a secret because they were friends. But Li Han is not easy. He will tell because she is also a friend. Students ran continuously, sweat dripping down. The other group was no less, running until exhausted. Engeldel shouted loudly for everyone to keep running. "Don't stop." The group of people lined up and ran one after another. The teacher did not forget to remind the students not to forget to inhale mana through breathing. The main goal is to raise physical strength to the highest level through regulating mana. The students immediately began to concentrate when they heard it. There are countless ways to utilize mana, including circulating mana throughout the body to increase endurance and strengthen. However, this period is very difficult for them. Students try to run and control their breathing well. Li Han ran up to the teacher and called out loudly. He just caught up with the teacher's speed and wanted to ask a question, and Engeldel immediately answered comfortably. He had something to climb a mountain and wanted to ask his teacher's advice. The scene changed to the mountains. The teacher was surprised by his words, but still listened quietly. Then he shook his head seriously and advised him to give up that idea, not forgetting to shake his head to indicate. Li Han was surprised and asked again how dangerous that place was. "There are not only monsters but also many other dangers, even the professors don't know," he said as he ran. The teacher turned around and said with a black face, "Rushing in arbitrarily was not a smart choice," and he was really serious and said that only idiots would enter. He helplessly said that it was an exercise to go up the mountain to find ingredients, not that he wanted to enter. Hearing the answer made Engeldel blush and feel shy. It turned out to be another professor's assignment. If that were the case, it would be different. He glanced at the teacher and the students behind him running after the two exhausted people. The teacher had to change the subject. He looked like he wasn't tired, guessing that he had succeeded in adjusting his mana. Li Han looked at his hand, but didn't quite say anything. His mouth was still breathing heavily. It was like he was releasing mana. Hearing it immediately made the teacher spray. To be able to release mana out and throughout the body, the important thing is the ability to control it accurately. But Li Han chose to release excess mana in all directions. When the teacher heard it, he rubbed his chin in thought. Engeldel thought he heard she did the same thing before when she played against the Sunset and Dawn team. Usually, Li Han would faint from lack of mana after that because it was no different from burning all his mana. But, under Li Han's feet was a blue, turbulent flow. He also possesses an infinite source of mana. This will be a useful method for him. Li Han stood on the wave looking forward. His eyes were now sparkling, shining with the light before his eyes. Enrolled told him the teacher would not forbid that method, making him a bit serious. However, in this class, the teacher wanted him to learn how to circulate mana. He agreed and felt that there were probably many dangers that he had not yet anticipated. And the professor hopes you have a lot of mana, so you should try to complete the mana rotation. Suddenly realizing the meaning in the professor's words, he realized the professor still wanted to say something. The professor turned around, making him not have time to figure out, wait. Enrolled said he would increase his training. His face was completely happy. He told him to run 10 more laps while talking and laughing. This sentence was like lightning hitting his ears. He was startled and frightened. Lihan bowed and trembled, wondering why the professors were here. They were all like that. Lihan's face turned pale. He smiled reluctantly, crying helplessly in his heart. One side is happy, the other side is like a dark cloud. My professor really likes this idea. But in the end, he still had to bow and thank the professor. When the professor heard him thank him, he was extremely happy. Then he stopped wiping the sweat he was wiping when the professor said to Lihan, by the way. He told him, I will go with you to the mountain to collect ingredients. He said in surprise, huh, the teacher just said it's okay if it's homework. Professor Enrolled heard Lihan say that and just smiled and said, that's true, I just like to walk. You looked at him confused but then replied, yes. After talking about that, Professor Enrolled asked Lihan, now we finish the running part, right? Lihan replied while running, yes. He looked at him and said to himself, if it was just exercise then nothing would happen. However, it is still a very dangerous place. Evening at Professor Euregilm's small hut. Yoner was reading a letter from Professor Euregilm, saying that he had to go out and forbade her to steal things from this hut. After reading the letter, Yoner could only gasp. Yoner then turned back to ask Lihan, that's why you called me here. Yoner happily said, because there are many alchemy tools here. Lihan immediately confirmed that it was correct. Lihan opened the box he had just picked up and said to Yoner, I also want to check the effects of the potion we had last time. After checking the contents of the box, Lihan said to Yoner, I don't know as much about alchemy as you. Yoner, hearing the compliment, Yoner smiled happily. I was also curious about their uses. Suddenly Yoner noticed a point. Yoner looked out the window and asked Lihan, wait, what is that, a field? Hearing Yoner's question, Lihan just calmly said, have you found out? She confusedly asked again, don't tell me you also plan to plant those things. Hearing that question, Lihan immediately replied, yes, but it will take a long time. I heard it will take several months. Yoner heard Lihan say that and pointed out the window wondering, but, I saw all the big trees. He followed the direction of her hand and looked. She meant, if you don't look, then stop looking and you will be extremely surprised. It was extremely surprising to see those trees wondering, really? Lihan remembered a few days ago and confirmed for himself that it was definitely the tree he planted. Lihan wondered confusedly, when did they become adults? Yoner didn't understand and asked him, what's wrong? Like remembering something. He looked towards the watering can on the garden chair and saw that the problem was with this watering can. Lihan understood and laughed. It seemed like the professor had used a growth drug or something like that. The professor was so impatient. Haha. Yoner heard him say that and said the same thing. Oh, so that's it. But actually this is just a normal watering can. The tree grew so fast because of Lihan's staff, but he didn't realize it. But they didn't know, so they blamed Euregilm. Lihan asked Yoner, if that's the case, how about we harvest today? How do you feel? Hearing him ask, she confidently replied, just leave it to me. Lihan and Yoner started taking the tools while preparing. He laughed and said, they grow so fast, and Yoner happily took the tools. After getting all the things, she happily held those things in her arms. The two only took the food and alchemy tools they needed and left, leaving a piece of paper on the wall. The content of the note left behind is, thank you Professor, we left some of the newly harvested items. Please feel free to sign Lihan Wardanez's name. Now only Euregilm knows how much or how little they took. The next day they went to Thanglong Tower. When packing all the things out, the two of them looked sadly at these things and asked Yoner if he meant this was a miracle medicine. Yoner just replied, yes. Looking at the pile of herbs on the ground, Lihan thought, unexpectedly, the two of them stayed up all night, busy testing medicinal herbs. Lihan looked at the pile of herbs and then looked at the medicine box and was hugging again, but thanks for staying up late. With delicious Western wine and the magical elixir, when you drink it, you can sing as well as a mermaid in a short period of time. Thanks to staying up late, he and she discovered the uses of these two potions. Li-han imagined himself after drinking the elixir and turning into a handsome mermaid. Suddenly Yoner spoke up, blowing Li-han's imagination away. She said darkly, "Sorry, I can only identify those two bottles." Hearing that reassures me, otherwise it would be great. Suddenly a sitting person came, and it turned out that two people were here. The person who came was Ashan, and she said good morning to you too. Ashan smiled and asked the two of you, "Are you two ready to collect the ingredients?" Hearing that, Li-han just replied, "A little." Because he had plans for this weekend, Saturday he and his friends would return from the forest, and on Sunday, he thought as he put his hand in his shirt. Then he took out his pass card because he planned to use the pass card to go outside the academy on Sunday. Then Li-han put it back in his shirt and thought, wondering what traps there would be. At this moment, Ashan turned to him and said, "Oh yes, Wardanis." She asked, "Do you want to walk around the black market before we go to the forest?" Li-han was surprised by the question. "Huh?" Asked again, "What market?" Ashan said. He led Li-han and Yoner into the market. When he got to the black market, he suddenly asked, "Do you have this too? What kind of academy has a black market?" Yoner next to him was also so surprised that he woke up. Li-han looked around, but seeing people buying and selling very enthusiastically, looking closely, we can see that it looks more like a farmer's market than a black market. The three of them started walking around the black market. Suddenly Li-han noticed a stall owner introducing, betting a loaf of bread for a loaf of bread just to find the king card. Ratford was sitting and spreading cards. Ratford explains the rules of the game. All you need to do is find the king card among these three cards. Whoever guesses correctly will get 2 loaves of bread instead of 1. Just as he finished summarizing the rules of the game, the players began to guess, and suddenly Ratford realized that Li-han was among the crowd watching. Ratford stood up in panic and said loudly, "Ah, Mr. Wardanis." The people sitting there saw Li-han and ran away in fear. When he saw everyone like that, he stood still and thought, "Don't avoid me like you're avoiding evil." Standing still for a moment, he regained his original appearance and asked Ratform, "What are you doing?" Ratford answered frankly, "I'm collecting bread." Li-han wondered, seeing bread. Ratford explained, "Yes, bread is used as currency here." Ratford explains, 5 loaves of bread can be exchanged for a brush, and by collecting 10 brushes you can exchange it for a matchbox-sized lump of sugar. Students from Tan Long Tower can eat thanks to Li-han, but other towers do not have the same. They have to make a very miserable living. Yoner noticed a stall, bent down to observe and asked the stall owner, "Can I see the goods?" The stall owner immediately replied, "Yes, of course," but then the stall owner recognized Li-han and was startled and shouted, "Ah, Wardanis." He just laughed and wondered, I should go look around a bit. Li-han noticed a stall with quite a few weapons and some food. He didn't expect there to be so many useful items, but quite a bit of food. Why was there even fake food? Li-han looked at another stall to continue evaluating. There were quite a few daily necessities. Li-han went to a booth and put his hand on it. There was something that caught Li-han's mind, but the thing that surprised him the most. Li-han stood and observed many auras radiating on both sides of the booth where he was standing. What surprised Li-han was the pile of antiques here. He didn't think there were so many interesting things here. Li-han placed his hands on the table and thought about what surprised him the most. He continued to put his hands in his pockets, pensively looking at the objects with light flying around on the wooden table. Just as his vision was attracted, what surprised Li-han the most was this pile of antiques. The green artifact stone appeared. Such artifacts are very rare, to the point that some people have never seen them in their entire lives. After that, Li-han quickly realized one thing: this place is Einrogard. The students studying here have countless talents, can create items, although rudimentary but very useful. And with life here, he can converse more naturally, if he is a student from Weinvu Tower. Ratford saw Li-han stop in front of a stall looking at things and leaned in to whisper, "Is there something you find beautiful? I've tried a few of these things before but they're useless." Stall owner, seeing Ratford's actions, he angrily wondered where this guy would blatantly sabotage his business. Li-han looked at the coat hanging horizontally on a wooden tree and asked Ratford about the cloak. Ratford replied that it was a protective cloak. This protective cloak can block attacks from sharp weapons, but the effect is only about 50%. After hearing Ratford say that, the stall owner seemed annoyed and used his hand to stab the knife directly into his armpit. Ratford made him panic. Li-han picked up the cloak and gently encouraged that this cloak still had useful points. Radford placed his hand on his chest, bowed his head and said in admiration to Li Han, "You are really great, looking at everything in a positive way. The light of tolerance is what makes you a true aristocrat."